Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm Dan Zehr. I'm the Vice President of Communications at Cambrian Futures. We're an advisory think tank that focuses on human-centric disruption and innovation in the global economy. Today, my colleagues and I will be discussing what we call Coronomics, which is roughly how to remain resilient in the face of the global pandemic economy. Now, as we all know, when we're looking into the future, it always involves a fair amount of uncertainty, even in the best of times, and these certainly aren't that. But crafting forward-looking strategy amidst a global pandemic can feel like driving in a heavy fog. We don't really have a detailed map we can use to chart out our forecasts and scenarios. So given this heightened uncertainty, Cambrian Futures is focused on resilience, how people and organizations can remain flexible as they navigate the possible outcomes of the pandemic and its effects on the economy. We believe this approach will help your organizations, but will also help lead to a more prosperous future for the world as a whole. So today we have three of Cambrian's thought leaders who will share some of their insights about the forces shaping the economy. We'll talk about the four main models for how the economy could develop from here and how organizations can remain resilient enough to capitalize on the opportunities that emerge. First, we have Olaf Groth, the founder and CEO of Cambrian Futures and Cambrian Designs. He's a professor, advisor, and executive for the global innovation economy. He's a global expert at the World Economic Forum, has more than 20 years of experience in corporations, consulting firms, and academia. We also have Terence Tse, senior advisor at Cambrian and professor of entrepreneurship and the co-founder and executive director of Nexus Frontier Tech. Nexus Frontier Tech is a firm that uses AI to make data machine usable and provides robust infrastructure for process automation. And finally, Mark Esposito is also a senior advisor here at Cambrian and the co-founder, along with Terence, of Nexus Frontier Tech. He's a professor of business and economics. He's advised governments, and he is a global expert in, he's a global expert at the World Economic Forum. So just a little bit on structure here. We'll begin with a 15-minute introductory presentation that Olaf, Terence, and Mark will run us through. But we want to reserve most of this hour for questions that you have. So hopefully we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes to run through those questions. Feel free to drop questions in the group chat. We'll try and squeeze in as many as we can, and we'll coalesce those and bring those together as we go along. Please note that we are recording this conversation and we'll make it available after the discussion concludes. And now I will hand it over to Terence.
Well, thank you very, very much everyone for coming. Really a great pleasure to be here. Let's start with the first slide, and what we could see, what we're trying to do here is very simple. We are trying to actually figure out what is the, what are the industries that are currently being impacted by the coronavirus. Now, what you notice is that the fonts are very small, and the reason is simple, because there are so many industries that are hard hit by the, by the pandemic. On the left-hand side, what you can see is, are these industries that are actually suffering a lot. As you can imagine, the brick and mortars retail, the airlines, restaurants, they are the ones that are really, really suffering. On the other hand, the ones that are less impacted include utilities, education, probably looking at some sort of a manufacturing, especially the healthcare mask manufacturers. I'm sure they're going to do very, very well later. On the right-hand side, in the green bubbles, what you will see are the industries that are actually currently thriving as a result. And what we'll talk about later on is what are the industries and what kind of phenomena we could expect to see, going forward in the future that will continue to thrive. What you can see, of course, it's home fitness, video conferencing, and hence what we're doing. Food delivery, these are all basically doing very, very well. I've just I read something this morning saying that cloud computing, for instance, is picking up in terms of share price for one simple reason. So the fact that more and more of us and businesses will actually be resorting to using computers, remote working and data. So it's not all bad or good. It is, I guess, a new phenomenon. The question, of course, is how can we actually do that? Olaf, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Terence, and welcome everybody. I'm equally privileged and happy to welcome you all here on this webinar. It's a real pleasure to see many familiar faces and many new faces as well. To build on what Terence was saying here, I think the main takeaway of what you see on this slide is that as you look at positive and negative impact, low and high long-term priorities, promise of growth. Keep in mind that the main charter for us as both business people as well as leaders is that we need to figure out, in this fog, in this mess that the COVID-19 crisis is, how do we assess past opportunity that we thought we had and against new opportunity horizons that are blossoming now. So what you see here on the right, especially in the upper right. And of course, I should say this is all but very high level estimations on our part because the world is so uncertain and it's very hard to quantitatively assess this in a very exacting way. Those are the areas that we think have a lot of resilience and that you will see featured throughout the next couple of slides as well. Okay. All right, thank you, Terence, and let's move on here and tell you why we're coming to you today and what we're bringing to you. As we thought about what will be the greatest value to you, we figured that it's always good to have a concrete set of steps that you can take, so we have packaged this into a little bit of a mini framework here for you, and we've given it a moniker, a name, if for no other reason than you being able to recall this more easily. And what we're calling it is Flip It, FLPIT, and it stands for 5 discrete steps. But really overall, the theme here is that we need to find ways to change our mindset and essentially flip it forward from a mindset of having lost opportunity in the past or the present, and obviously needing to mourn that and assess that and be very honest about that, but then also flip our gaze forward into opportunity horizons that are lying in the fog or even behind the fog. And so Flip It stands for forces, logic, phenomena, impact, and triage, and these 5 steps can get you to flip your view, right? So forces has to do with understanding the dominant forces that are emerging in the fog. Logic has to do with colliding and combining some of these forces to see what kind of new operating logic, which is sort of a high concept, right? An operating logic of how the future might be operating that lies ahead. These forces colliding will create a new operating logic, and there's different variants of that. And then once you have the operating logic or logics, look at phenomena and pattern that are emerging. Those patterns and phenomena will then have an impact on your businesses and on society overall. And we'll show you how we look at that. And then finally, we have to triage opportunity, which is getting back to the last slide, where we need to understand how do we assess past opportunity as worthy of fixing or maybe having to let it go versus new opportunity that lies ahead of us that we need to seize, right? So with that said, remember the Flip It acronym because we'll unpack that for you now, okay? Over to you, Mark.
Sure. Thank you, Olaf, and also from my side, thank you for joining us today. And it's a pleasure to see many familiar faces and many new friends. As Olaf has now shared with you the idea of Flip It, we equally want to share with you how we conducted this exercise ourselves to be able to provide you with some insight on where we think the post-pandemic will possibly lead us. So we have made a selection of forces. These are some of the forces that became part of our brainstorming We tend to select forces in terms of the degree of uncertainty and the degree impact that will actually exercise on a relatively short-term future or middle-term future. And you recognize many of these being somehow conversations that you are finding in the media, in the large coverage we have right now of the pandemic. And we thought these are somehow a selection of good forces that will allow us to really understand the bookends of what we consider to be an important process in defining opportunity to foresee where the future might possibly take us. If you're not familiar with the process of scenario planning and mainly a matrix, it's just a way to start looking at possibility. It's not necessarily a certain future. And what is important is to imagine that by going through the exercises, we might be able to find spaces in which these forces are somehow intersecting that suggest a possible plausible future. So what you see somehow following this slide is really where we think there is an opportunity for your Q&A to somehow support this conversation, which is where the future logic is going to take us. So I'm going to invite Olaf to take us through our 4 scenarios by starting with the first one.
I appreciate that, Mark. Thank you. So we showed you a number of different buckets of forces that Mark just talked through. And needless to say, that, you could probably be coming up with another 2 dozen or so. There are ways to prioritize these, and we can talk about those priorities. But essentially, it also doesn't matter very much which ones you pick to think about, as long as they fulfill one criterion, and that is they have to be high impact and they have to be high uncertainty. We cannot run away from uncertainty, right? So we have to encounter it head on and embrace the variability. And so what that means is here, for example, we took 2 forces, and that is the adaptive capacity of societal institutions, either being coordinated and coherent or disparate and incoherent, okay? And this essentially means, the institutions that are currently giving away money, the current institutions that are currently trying to find a virus vaccine or cure, all of the societal institutions, how well are they coordinated inside a country or a region and beyond, between countries. And then the second force is the impact of stimulus and rescue packages by governments. How are they sequenced? Where are they hitting? Are they calibrated well, right? So we have a choice here between, if you think in extremes, between igniting pockets of growth and engorging pockets of wealth, okay? And clearly we want the former, not the latter. So if you just combine and collide those forces and then layer in some of the others that we have been showing you, then you can come up with some archetype futures that are bookends to how the world might be evolving. It's not about forecasting, it's not about predicting, it's about exercising foresight on that which is plausible, okay? And then you realize that once you have captured the bookends, the extremes, the reality as it will unfold will fall in between, right? We are going to be experiencing an environment that is probably a hybrid of these, okay? And so the first one here I'm going to walk you through is the medieval mess, right? So this is a world in which we will see a perpetual sort of toggling back and forth of restraint and relief, meaning, people are coming out of lockdown, out of quarantine, then they're going to get pulled back in as new waves of the virus hits. That is driven by large part by institutions not being very well coordinated. At the same time, we're not really doing a great job at getting money to the right people. So instead of giving it to the entrepreneurs, the small business owners, local governments, and of course the consumer to stimulate livelihoods, okay, and later demand, if we don't do that and we give money to just rich and wealthy investors, then that may also fulfill some purpose, but it's not going to get the economy restarted. And economists agree on that. So this is a world in which you see a medieval mess at low growth with a few fiefdoms arising.
And thanks so much, Olaf, for this. In the second scenario that we like to propose to you, we're looking at technocracy triumph. This is a scenario where we see a clear winner and loser to simplify the conversation, Asia as a bloc becoming the prevailing bloc in the world, where we see more and more emphasis, both from an economic and a social perspective, being shifted over to Asia. We also noticed that countries in the EU and the US might be trapped into prolonged and quite extenuating unemployment, which of course will generate a lot of social unrest. And we see somehow those countries capable of really addressing the crisis with determination, but also with some form of social cohesion, will be able to actually prevail the most. We see this as a U-shape, as you know this as well. We think there will be, of course, a period of volatility that will be difficult to eventually normalize. But clearly, we will notice that the country that will have managed the processes better, that will have created the right level of social engagement, and that will have been fast in making sure that this pandemic was behind, will equally prevail. We also see a number of countries struggling with the implication or repercussion of a crisis that has been to some extent mismanaged. And that's where I think we see worries for this lingering of a lack of recovery that we don't see happening fast enough. So clearly the divide on a global level will shift more and more, both geoeconomically and geopolitically. We'll see this shifting more and more towards Asia. In the next scenario, I would like to invite Terence to take us through frugal feudalism.
This is probably the worst of all scenarios that and I hope that we will be able to avoid. So unfortunately, there are every single signs that are really showing that this actually can happen. Government managed to somehow suppress the virus and bails out a lot of different large corporations. The problem, of course, is that all the money ended up supposedly saving the general public. They all ended up going to the hands of those people who own assets and capital. In other words, the money goes to those who have got the rich, and they have the rich will become richer. At the same time, because the rich have got nowhere to invest or invest in certain very in capital assets, they what happened is jobs will still become very scarce, and therefore they're we're looking at higher employment. At the same time, what comes with higher employment, of course, is low purchasing power. So, basically the cycle continues. Now, one can actually imagine the fact that, in certain regions, things will be a bit better, but in other regions, perhaps, the developing countries, they are probably going to find it very, very difficult to actually get out of a situation as such. So, in many ways, because governments are becoming, governments are going to play a much bigger role together with the businesses, the laborers, the people who don't belong in any of these buckets, they are probably left to their own devices. And, if there's a good thing coming out of it, what we'll probably see is some sort of frugal innovations, but serving a very, very local, conditions and, situations. So this is the reason why there is a bathtub look-alike a symbol at the bottom, because this is the bathtub shape of economic recovery is probably the one that we are not looking forward to. But in contrast, what we hopefully we can achieve, of course, is the next one, the V-shape the V-shape bounce back in terms of GDP. So Olaf, all yours.
Thank you, Terence. And this is one that you all are going to like, and I'm going to say something about that very fact here after I describe it. This is a world in which we were able to stimulate demand and employment broadly because we were well coordinated and we got the money to the right spots in these different economies, and that leads to a lot of new entrepreneurial innovation and new higher levels of growth. So this isn't necessarily back to where we were before the crisis, because we want to make one thing very clear. We're not going back anywhere. This is forward, and the texture of this will also be quite unique. But you can easily see how this might feel like a utopia, right? Because it's a V-shaped recovery as opposed to, let's say the medieval mess, which was sort of a prolonged W, or the long bathtub form recovery in frugal feudalism. This is one where we recover fairly quickly, maybe after 2 or 3 quarters, and we're out of the doldrums and are playing at a higher level of growth. So this feels utopian, just like medieval mess might feel a little dystopian, okay? And the others might be somewhere in the middle. The message here is that it's not so much whether these feel or sound positive or negative. The message here is that whatever the feeling is, whatever the flair is, we are likely going to live in a world that will fall somewhere between these 4 quadrants. And what's important is to understand these extremes, and then prepare for the stuff that is common across all of them, okay? And this is where we are talking about phenomena and patterns as we go to the next slide, and my colleague Terence is going to lead us into that.
So we have identified 8 patterns and phenomena that are actually currently happening. So the first one, of course, is we need to deal with the short-term priorities, cash situations, job situations, health situations, of course, but that is probably short term. I think going forward, in the longer run, what we start to see is M&As. A lot of mergers and acquisitions activities. Companies are not doing well, so they have got no choice but to actually sell themselves out. Those companies who managed to survive this and thrive on the pandemics, they will probably have lots of cash, and therefore they would actually want to buy. So we're going to see a lot of M&A activities. We are going to see, as you can imagine, decentralized supply chains. There was a very interesting quote that says, we always believe that there is a so-called global supply chain when all there is actually just a Chinese supply chain. So there is a very, very good chance that we will be seeing a lot of nearshoring, inshoring, or at least, lessen our dependence on China as a, to provide the material and components. The next one, hybridized work, we don't have to actually add more by every one of us is working from home. It, in all likelihood, including education, I guess, it will become more and more like a hybrid of online and offline. We are going to see probably more like a use of data, real-time data. Probably, some country like Germany, which is very, very, very much against, the use of public data and data privacy. As a result of this pandemic, they're probably going to loosen up a lot, as a result, as a result. So we're probably going to see a lot, more use of real-time data. Automation. There will be a lot of automations, and I think there is already a report that came out not very long ago, and it was asking what companies would do, and two of the things that they're going to do, reconsider at the very least right now is 1, automate the back end, and 2, getting more digital transformation done and quicker. And the reason is simple, because this is the easiest way and the quickest way to ensure at least medium, if not long-term, gains in terms of saving cost and therefore maintaining profitability. We're probably going to see a lot of platform powers being solidified. Everyone is going onto the platform as well. And last but not least, we are going to see a lot more local activities done online. Mark, have you got anything to add, onto these phenomena?
Thanks for this there. I hope that the echoes will be less now, that I look like a DJ. So I am hoping that, the voices be less bumpy. Something I'd like to add on this is, of course, the fact that when we hear or when we read about deglobalization, this would be pretty much an interesting way to represent that deglobalization, where you might notice a profound change in the supply chains. The fact that more countries will resort to national production because it's becoming critical to their own survival in case of a future crisis. And we see more and more this also in the dialogue and the narrative coming from national leaders, that there is this desire to build some form of local production, mainly in critical areas that can be interesting for national security, such as, for example, food, pharma, and some form of independence from the global supply chain. While it might look like to be just one small aspect, it's going to be a major aspect that will redefine globalization for what globalization has not been before. It doesn't mean that we will no longer be global. I think it's hyperbolic to think that we're no longer going to be a global community, but I think many areas will mainly start seeing contraction that from the global supply chain. There will be an effort to inshore, and that naturally generate major earthquakes in the accounts of capitals and of course trade around the world. If I can invite you to join me in the next slide as well. We start thinking about really what this pandemic has really proven to us is that we were really living on a heritage of relatively fragile economies. These are two archetypes that tend to be used in system thinking, where we're mainly looking at the fact that we might have mainly shifting the burden to the point in which we start shifting more and more maybe to the future. The example of the fact that we haven't invested significantly in healthcare infrastructure for pandemics because we did not see this being an imminent problem. Or we tend to have reactive behavior where we tend to put patches on the broken road, but we're not necessarily understanding that we're not necessarily healing the system. We're simply extending when the problem will actually occur, and very likely the side effect will become even more predominant. So the fragility of the system is where we think we have an opportunity, as we will have to redesign some of our mainly social engagement with the institutions and the economic way of measuring value, to think about building our next wave in a more anti-fragile way, or at least in a way in which, as our webinar wants to inspire you, there will be some form of resilience that will be gained after this. Just for you to make sure that we have an understanding of this, we tend to talk about resilience when we are gaining from shocks. So a lot of what we're hoping by our webinar is to inspire some post-traumatic growth that will only happen in the moment in which we'll be able to recognize why the system was fragile in the first place, and that changes are inevitable because of the entropy of our economies, but also how this will generate a major shock at first because the system are mainly reassessing and refinding a form of equilibrium, and whether we'll be able to really play an important role in making sure that the equilibrium will not be paid with a significant number of people that will have, for example, no job or no access to healthcare, is a key important part of our conversation. I'd like to invite, I think in my order is Olaf to our conversation now. Actually, sorry, Terence, it's you this time. When we're looking more at the impact in the value chain, trying to bring it down more into a strategic look. What it would look like to live under the dome of this post-pandemic world.
Thank you, Mark. I'm very wary of the time because we are already halfway through the seminar, and I think there are lots of questions pouring through. So just very quickly, what we're doing here is just to use a very simple example of a very high simplified value chain of Zara. And what you can see in front of you is that there will be winners and there will be losers in in terms of the different stages, the various stages we defined in the chain. The key here is that the value chain for pretty much probably we think every single company is going to change as a result. The question, of course, is, how are we, what are the things that, we can see opportunities in, and, what are the things that, we can hopefully, be able to get some benefits from. Olaf, what do you say?
Yeah, so I think, what Bear is pointing out here is that, value chains are all about power, okay? Power determines what kind of margins you have in a value chain. And so you need to understand now analytically in your value chain for each business, who is up and who is down, right? Or who is maybe even out, or maybe who is coming in anew that carries more leverage with them. So if there is new automation happening here on on sourcing raw materials, for instance, through robotics or whatever it may be, or source diversification, and there's innovation happening, then likely the power dynamics with the resource suppliers will shift, right? Equally, if your distributors are down, that's of course not good for your sales channels, and there may be some leverage to be had if you can help them out with loans and other co-funding opportunities. So in every value chain that has breakage and that has leakage and that has people dying or going away or becoming weaker or sometimes stronger, there is actually opportunity for you to go in and innovate and reconfigure in your favor. But you have to put some thinking into who that is that's up and down, right? Okay, so with that said, let's go to the next slide. And here we come to, you know, the T in Flip It, right? Which is the last step, and that's triage. And that is, once you understand the operating logic of the future emerging or the possibilities, and you go to the phenomena and you see the impact, then of course you can say, okay, now what am I going to do next? I'm going to look at my old portfolio, which is still sort of the business plan that you are running to, okay? And you look at, what do I have to let go of and write it off? What can I fix and how much is it going to cost? And then you look forward into new opportunity horizons that we have charted for you here. And look, this is just a list of, you know, of a bunch of examples that we have identified. There's of course many more, and they very much depend on, you know, what your business is. But if you're looking at some of these, let these stimulate you in terms of, you know, do those agree with me and my horizon where my business may be going once we come out of the fog, right? If not, what do I want to add in here? If it is, then which ones do I want to seize? And, you know, for everything I seize, I have to let go of something else, right? Strategy is just as much about, you know, what we no longer do as it is about what we want to do, right? So triaging between old opportunity and new opportunity is really critical. Mark and Terence, anything to add here?
So Olaf, thank you very much. In the interest, I think, of time, so that we can dive right into the questions, I think this slide share with you some ideas that we had as we're doing brainstorming as a preparation. So I'm not going to go deep into any of this. I guess you recognize this sixth area to be critical. And they also were echoing what we have discussed at the very beginning. So I'll leave it here as a point of reference where we think we have to triage. I'm not sure whether, Terence, you have anything to add on this. And I think we're going to get ourselves ready for the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Okay.
So back to you, Dan.
Thank you, gentlemen. Quick reminder that you can drop questions into the group chat function here on Zoom, and we'll try and coalesce these. We're getting some similar ones and some themes emerging, and we'll ask as many as we can here in the remaining time. While we're compiling those, I'll just throw out a practical one to transition here. What are the first next steps that leaders can take? 2 or 3 things maybe that leaders can do to prepare for the coming months and years. And Mark, let's start with you.
Sure. So thanks for this, Dan. Well, I think we truly have to start thinking that the ambiguity of, on one side, the crisis, the healthcare crisis, and the need for us to redesign both our socioeconomic fabric, they have to coexist. I've been noticing an incremental approach in the way governments are currently dealing with this. They start to flatten the curve first, and then they try to initiate initiative for recovering the economy. The fact that we're having a delay between one factor and the other implies there is some form of relationship which is incremental. None of this is incremental. We're no longer in the incremental world. We truly are into non-linear structures. So we have to start learning on surviving with the ambiguity that the cohabitants with the virus needs to be equally shared with the ability to recover at least the dialogue on the socioeconomic fabric, mainly because something that I tend to remind the classes that I teach these days, the economy is not like an airplane that you can simply land and take off again. It requires a significant amount of effort for an economy to restart. And we don't have a blueprint that really tells us what to do. We cannot read out of the manual. So I think triage also in the ability to redesign the institutional, mainly macro, meso, and micro is important at this point in time. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you. Another question that popped up early on, and one that's, again, kind of a practical question. Given cash shortages we're seeing in many industries, and sort of some of the basic difficulties sort of on the base levels of Maslow's pyramid for businesses, you know, how do you go about remaining resilient with basic fundamental needs in question? How do you balance the near-term pain with the longer-term outlooks? And maybe I'll throw that to Olaf and Terence.
I can actually.
Go ahead, Terence.
You know what? Oh, go ahead, Olaf.
Please, sir, it's all yours.
Go ahead, Terence.
So, like, to start with, right? I think there are two questions there. One is cash. I think, you know, like the dash for cash is something that I think like every company is doing right now. I think this is a very like you know, short-term priorities that every single company would need to figure out. I think like down the road, the more like the bigger question is, you know, in inequality. It is going to be something that is going to hit us, like you were saying, you know, the Maslow pyramid, right? You know, the basic essentials. You know, for any one of us who are actually listening into, you know, this webinar today, congratulations, because like you actually have spent less of your disposable income on the most basic essential stuff, food and rent and bills to pay. But there are lots of people who who actually sees the most, if not all, their income and wages actually going towards all of these basic essentials. The question, of course, is, you know, like tying up with the, you know, one of the questions that I saw, you know, regarding the gap, you know, the income gap, is that governments are pumping in money. That's a good stuff. You know, furloughing. That's also great, but how can we ensure that, you know, inequality, the gap is going to be, you know, you stop it from widening to start with? It is a very, very big question, and I'm really hoping that with this pandemic, we will be able to see some actions taken in terms of narrowing the gap. Olaf.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly second that, Terence, right? I mean, so cash is king, and especially in this crisis, and especially if you're a small business, right? Maybe slightly less of an issue if you're a large corporation, especially if you're a tech corporation with billions of dollars in the bank. You know, and again, I come back to the value chain. You have to free up cash. You have to figure out what is dead and what should you no longer invest in. And you have to make those decisions very quickly before things hit you in the face, right? So once suppliers, for instance, go bankrupt and there is going to be restructuring, you know, and you're going to have to pull the plugs on, you know, out of something that is dying, that's going to be a lot of transaction costs. So make the determination as to who is up and who is down quickly to free up cash and to parlay it over, to play it over into new growth horizons. The same is true for internal operations. And here, that's the toughest part of them all, right? Because that's people. And we're all about people. We are people. We know the pain. We know the anxieties right now. But you have to take the same look at what activities inside the company will just not be in, you know, in that sweet spot of, you know, phenomena and patterns anymore that are arising, and shift. And you have to do that decisively. And that's really hard because we care about employees, and we have to care, and we have to communicate empathy. These are tough times. People are losing their jobs, and yet we also have to expect and act on some degree of agility and flexibility. And so, you know, for me, what's important is, and I tell this to my clients, is you have to communicate empathy for the hardship, then tell people there's a path and give them hope that it's a good path, right? And that's part of what we're baked into these 5 steps, is give them a vision of the future that's worth living and worth having. And then you say, your job's going to change. I'm going to have to shift your activity set over here. And I know that's not what you wanted, but that's what we got to do to survive. And that only works if you give them hope that there is a better career and a better life beyond, right? So this is going to happen anyway. You can let it happen to you, or you can make it happen, right? So those would be the 2 types of advice I would give on that.
Another set of questions that's coming up has to do with, well, more broadly with globalization, borders, and that sort of thing. When looking at this, in particular, when it's coming to transportation, for example, and supply chains, and a lot of that cross-border activity, how do you see that playing out going forward? You know, does the globalization of the economy actually help in a recovery in a response to a pandemic, or you know, will we see a lot more isolation that hinders that, or how do you see that playing out? And Mark, I'll throw that to you to start.
Sure, Dan, thanks for this. I think before the pandemic, we were already walking on really thin ice. We started noticing that nationalism and the rise of more populist narrative and rhetoric was somehow already permeating into a number of different countries around the world. We already start seeing countries that were prioritizing their interests by insourcing already some of the production. Some of this was very unrealistic because the cost of production is really what matters. And so even if people were talking about insourcing sometime, they could have not, because the requirement of insourcing might have been of a higher financial exposure than what they could have afforded. That said, the pandemic has now given a wonderful opportunity and a silver plate for a number of different governments to tighten even more their rhetoric on nationalism. So I would imagine that, yes, we'll see a contraction. We'll see people that will take time before they might possibly invest. So I think trade and supply chain, they equally have a relationship with FDI. We'll see naturally investors be more reluctant, waiting until there's signals that something is looking to some extent interesting again. And we're going to go back to what Terence said before. We'll have an increasing amount of people, and also Olaf mentioned this, capital holder that will start having a lot of mainly cash, but not interested to deploy this in the economy, because we don't really know how to measure the risk anymore. And I think this is one of the major problems. Before, we knew how to assess the risk. Today, how do you assess the risk? Do you assess it by how quickly a government can reopen the economy? Do you assess it on the possible restriction that the government will impose on products coming in from a given country? How do you assess this is really where I see first a major shock, but also an opportunity to rewrite the rules of the WTO that were to some extent on a stock of knowledge that was somehow initiated in the previous century. Again, I tend to see that we are finally looking at the redesign of our architecture, but I'm also afraid that when we shut down a border, we tend to maybe understand that we can do it again and again and again and justify this under whatever type of pretext. So that's the part that worries me the most.
Can I add one more point to what Mark was saying? So the way I see it is this, you know, with the pandemic, right? So like Mark was saying, you know, even before the pandemic, we're working on thin ice already. There are lots of people voicing, oh, you know what, like a nationalism, we need to bring it back, you know, and probably as a result of the pandemic, we are going to see a lot more local produce, you know, suppliers coming back to the same shore. At the same time, we'll probably start to realize that, you know, we cannot actually be surviving on our own. You know, look at Boris Johnson. When he came out of the ICU suffering from the coronavirus, he actually thanked 2 nurses in particular. And where were the 2 nurses from? First one, New Zealand. Second one, Portugal. And this was the very person who actually made it very, very clear that he doesn't want any immigrants to come into this country and take up jobs. So, you know, would this time around, they, you know, governments started to see, you know, if you know, having an open border, having you know, having allowing people to come in is actually a good thing. I think you know, it's going to be a mix of you know, of answers.
And let me layer on to that, because this is such a rich question, right? And really, it's such a macro level theme. You know, I think when you ask yourself about globalization versus localization or degree of globalization, you have to realize, you know, we've always, I mean, we've been global even through this period of, you know, people, demagogues, you know, saying and rallying emotions to the opposite. When you look at an analysis of flows, we have been very global. That will not, let's say, stop in its tracks, as it were. But we will see a very different texture. You know, our hunch is that we'll be going, you know, virtually global and locally physical, meaning that, you know, a lot of physical activity will happen on a local level, but then on a global level, we will see a shift toward more of a mix, right? And more toward virtual. So globally virtual and locally physical, I think will be a theme to reckon with. And so the flows will continue, but how we execute on them will be quite different. And I'll give you an example with global supply chains. You know, we're probably going to see more models like today's procurement models, right? Where you have Alibaba, Amazon, SAP, Ariba. They already source materials and supplies for companies globally at a moment's notice. I think with global supply chains, we'll be seeing something very similar, where we will have smart platforms that are getting ever more powerful, and probably in this crisis will go a bit longer unregulated. And we'll see those spring up to facilitate a more agile model of sort of switching back and forth. When China drops away, let's go to Vietnam. When Vietnam drops away, let's go to wherever, Uganda, okay, for certain types of supplies, with a lot more intelligence at the center. So flows will continue, but how we do it will materially change.
Another set of questions about startups. Startups both in relation to the resources they have to develop in an environment like this, but also in their advantages or disadvantages to larger companies. How do you see those interactions? Is this an especially good time with opportunity to go out and find, or you know, are the big players going to remain the dominant gorillas in the room? And Terence, I'll throw that to you to start.
Right, that's a hard question. I mean, like startups, I guess, you know, the first thing, you know, one of the things that startups, like, and this is certainly the experience we have got with our company, it's cash. You know, like if we have got enough cash, then we can survive. If we have got enough cash, we don't have to furlough our our employees. So, you know, like I think like immediate survival is critical, and I think like you know, that is indisputable. I think going forward, we are going to see more and more large companies like dominating the scenes for one simple reason, because like large companies are in a much better position when it comes to borrowing. And when there's not enough cash around, these guys have got one, like it's a lot easier for them to borrow. It's a lot cheaper for them to borrow, so they would have a lot more money, like a lot more cash to survive this. And second, as a result of of this pandemic, lots of SMEs will actually go out of business, including the startups. The big companies will actually eat up more of the markets. So the way I see it, unfortunately, is that, you know, big companies are going to see a much bigger role. That is on top, you know, all of this on top of all of this. You know, let's not forget that government is going to play a much bigger role. They are going to probably become one of the biggest producers of things, and probably biggest buyers of things as well. So it all depends on the government policy and whether they would end up cozying up with the big companies. That I think remains to be seen. Anyone want to add? Olaf, Mark, would you like to add?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Terence. Thank you. And I think, you know, I'm actually quite worried about startups, I have to tell you. And normally I wouldn't be because, you know, startup entrepreneurs, you know, have a special social contract with us, right? They take very high risk. They're very likely to not succeed. But when they do, then they get wealthy. And we thank them for it, because we need startup entrepreneurs to help us through renewals in society after crises, or with structural deficiencies, or with, you know, upgrading sunset industries and things of that nature. They're super valuable. And here we are in this crisis, and you all probably read the, you know, Sequoia memo and similar. You know, a lot of the VCs are now battening the hatches and no longer funding new startups. It's gotten really tough, and a lot of the ones in the existing portfolios will go belly up. And so I think some technocracies, to Terence's point, like Germany, for instance, are doing a good job, I think, stepping to the side of some of these entrepreneurs and saying, let us help you out with preferential loans and things of that nature. And I normally am not a big fan of government handouts and subsidies, but in this instance, where there is a wave of fallout for one of the biggest and most important, change agents, right, in our economy, and that's startups. You know, we need to keep that alive to help us transform the economy as we come out of the fog. And so, so I agree, the government has a big role to play on this particular front.
So Olaf, if I can just, as I think like before, important question and difficult just to answer within the time we have, but it's also an opportunity for government to think more in terms of entrepreneurial loans and the way in which we can think about government debt to change from what is the previous model of government debt. Equally, how do we move away from the impasse the bank are not excited or willing to actually lend? This is also a very important part. When Terence mentioned about large company, they have a facility to borrow easier. That's absolutely one of the problems we have. It's also important to remember that before this implosion of startup, we used to have industrial conglomerates. It's because we have liberated capital in the economy that the risk taker decided to become innovator and then eventually entrepreneur. So it's likely to imagine that if we don't do this, we're going to go back to conglomerates, that power is concentrated in the hands of few players. The problem with that is that this large entity do not have the same need to innovate because they don't go through the same rule of competition that happens when you have a much more diverse ecosystem. I think it's important to understand what kind of world we're trying to inherit after this and how government can actually try to correct a normal trajectory that will go in the direction of mainly drying the well for the startup. So back to you, Dan.
Another set of questions that's coming up is sort of jumps off that, the question of the balance of influence and power between governments and the private sector. But taking that one step further, there's a few interesting questions about what this means for international organizations, for the Bretton Woods organizations and that sort of thing. How do you see the influence of a United Nations, World Trade Organization? Where is their role in all this in sort of helping the private sector navigate through it and helping economic recovery?
I mean, maybe then I can kick off and then let Terence and Olaf, and I'll be brief. I think before the pandemic, we were already suffering a lot from a quite archaic and obsolete institutional framework that this institution had, saying that the UN, IMF, or World Bank are fast mover or agile is to some extent a difficult statement to make, or in this specific case, the WHO. Let's say that disinvesting completely from them is, in my opinion, problematic because the nature of the challenges we're going to see are more and more multilateral. So disinvesting into multilateral institutions is to some extent not what we should do. But clearly, many of these institutions are feeling the full weight of the crisis, and I'm hoping they'll be able to reform and modernize. When they started, the world in 1944 was very different than what we have right now. So I think it will be a necessary, almost like part of a competitive necessity for this institution to actually modernize. Otherwise, they'll become somehow obsolete and inconsequential to address the challenges we're going to see, not just now, but also in the future. Maybe Olaf?
Yeah, I'm happy to layer onto that, Mark. I fully agree. I think, you know, we will see a greater push for reform of the existing Bretton Woods system. These institutions change very slowly, and you could argue, you know, that was a good thing because, you know, stability relies on slow pace. That said, you know, clearly we're seeing a lack of, I think, responsiveness to economic and political realities around the world. As China is coming out of this corona crisis the quickest, and as some other Asian economies and societies are following suit, you know, that have, you know, very skilled technocracies running the show. I'm thinking about, you know, obviously South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, but even places like Vietnam as well. We'll see these countries pull ahead and I think carry more weight in the global economy and the global political regime. And so, you know, funds and institutions like the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, for instance, I think will become more important as these economies start to pull harder than Western economies. Now, that's an oversimplification, but I think it shows that this crisis is pushing on some and accelerating some trends that are happening already.
Thanks again to everyone for dropping questions in here. Obviously, we won't be able to get to all of them, and we'll try and respond offline where we can to some of these, whether via email and other ways to reach out. But since we're hitting just about to the top of the hour here, we'll add one last question about the impact of the crisis on wealth inequality and how this might play out in emerging countries in particular. And, you know, even maybe to at a broader level, how does this have any sort of lasting impact on capitalism as a whole? I mean, how does this play out at a macro level? And Olaf, maybe I'll just start with you and we can go from there.
Yeah, I do think that we're going to see, you know, a revamp of institutions and more pressure on political systems. We are going to see greater income disparity and greater poverty coming out of this because, you know, right now we do not have a sufficient degree of coordination, collaboration between global institutions or national institutions globally. You know, and a lot of money is going into the wrong places, if you ask me. You know, especially when we're looking at how already socioeconomically underprivileged parts of populations, really in any country, but especially in developing countries, are now getting an extra beating because they're not digital. You know, they do not have the resilience means of sheltering themselves very effectively. You know, I'm thinking about, you know, the images or the stories that we've all read about, you know, migrant workers in India walking 18 hours to local villages and then being put in cages because the village administration doesn't want them in the village infecting everybody else. And then they're stuck in cages without food and water. You know, but I'm also thinking about public education here in the United States, right? We don't need to look far. A lot of public school students in the United States are not able to continue education on Zoom or other video conferences, whereas private school kids are. So we are seeing, I think, you know, sort of the scissor shape being pushed to open further. And I think we need to do something about it because these are, of course, and rightfully so, voters that will voice their frustration, right? So both from an empathy standpoint, but also from a political standpoint, we need to make sure that we close those scissors again and pretty fast because already institutions and democracy are under fire. I don't need to point that out. That's obvious to everybody, right?
Terence and Mark, do you want to, another question that's come in, and I'll just wrap this in very quickly if I can. We're talking about different economies, different countries and that sort of thing, but there's also a layer of questions here about different skill levels, for example. Blue collar skills, low skill workers and that sort of thing, and including many that are sort of essential workers on the front lines of a lot of this. You know, does that scissor shape play out similarly along skills as it does along wealth and affluence?
You know what, I think, you know, this is one of those things that are really truly, you know, to show the unfairness of the society. The key skilled workers, they are the one who is paid the least. You know, like if you look at a lot of like people who are actually keeping the economy going out there, even as we were sitting at home trying to do our work, a lot of them are actually working as a gig economy, you know, as a freelancers. They have got no no protection at all whatsoever. Even if like the government is handing out furlough, there's no way they can actually like, you know, they can benefit from it. And yet, you know, they are the one who are actually keeping the ones keeping the economy going. So you know, it's unjust, and so you know what I see is that, you know, you know, the gap is only going to widen as we like go forward. And I just, unless, you know, there is a radical readjustments to it, I just don't see how, you know, like how we can end up, you know, like solving a problem as big as this, you know, or even mitigating it. Mark, have you got anything to add?
Terence, I think just to support what you're saying, we all see this increasing gap becoming wider and wider. This is also the fact that many of the essential workers somehow they are in the physical world, so they work into some form of physical production. What we're going to lose is mainly all of those workers that were part of the more creative economy, part of the knowledge economy that can now be replaced also in terms of the automation. We saw in one of the possible phenomena is the increase in automation and robotics, and we see this happening at a faster pace. So we're going to see somehow a lack of distribution of economic value through the traditional social contract, which brings me to really think that if we had pretty much, it was like being invited to a great party where everything was great, everybody was able to enjoy, regardless of your social status. Crises of this magnitude, they really teach us that social contract needs to be redesigned in light of the type of challenge we currently have. And that's the part that I think we were very naive by thinking that by being an Uber driver, as far as you got cash coming in, that will be good enough. Well, that will be good enough to eventually go over, let's say, a sick moment or maybe an accident if you're able to eventually recover. But what if now we have in a mega condition or macro condition, such as a country being shut down? These are conditions that we were never envisioning. So I'm hoping that from ensuring the risk to redefining employment contract to also understanding social contract in the 21st century in light of the nature of systemic crisis we're going to face as we move into the next decades. I think it will be an important part of the conversation. Otherwise, as both Terence and Olaf has mentioned, the divide will become so deep that this will be a more severe crisis than what we had in 1929. Just as a point of reference, in 1929, we had about 25% of people in the US that were unemployed, and we call it Great Depression. We're looking at next year, 2021, between 10 and 30% of people in the US without having a job. That is already a significant social impact that we have to actually mitigate. And maybe just to give a little bit of hope to all of us somehow, and also you listening to this, we are still in the place where we can change the trajectory of where we see this going. One of the reasons why I think Olaf, Terence, and I wanted so much to have a conversation with you is not to merely give you this impression that we're doomed, but if we're not actively changing the narrative we're hearing right now, what we see as a trajectory doesn't look to be a bright color. And that's where I think we have to be equally vigilant in what is currently happening right now. Back to you, Dan.
Dan, let me just say one word on this. You know, I fully agree with Mark and Terence, and we need to experiment. We need to experiment with new types of social and unemployment insurance schemes because global platforms aren't going away. The gig economy isn't going away. It'll continue because platforms are becoming ever stronger, as you saw. And yet we got to experiment with new models of insuring people and making sure that they're kept healthy. While we do that, how do we keep them alive? How do we keep them healthy? And here, of course, universal basic income comes to mind, and whatever one thinks of it, we need to experiment more with concepts like it until they work. And so if you can do one thing in your life, follow and support these experiments, because experiment we must, right? Back to you, Dan.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have time for today. We have hit and passed the top of the hour, but a couple notes. Please join us for our virtual Thought Leaders Summit on May 26. We'll hope to collaborate with you to bring a little more clarity to the pandemic and the post-pandemic economies. And we'll bring in our thought leadership network from around the world to pitch in with that. And we'll share more information about that soon. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I'll conclude myself with best wishes for all of you for your health and safety and welfare, and send it over to Olaf for his parting thoughts.
Yes, look, on behalf of Cambrian and my friends and colleagues, Mark and Terence at Cambrian, we really appreciate your time. And you're the leaders who will make this happen. We need to renew and reinvent, and there's lots of opportunity to do that. And so we're bringing you another one in this series, hopefully toward the end of May. We're currently thinking about May 26th, but the date hasn't been set yet. So stay on the lookout for us setting that date on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And we hope you can join us there again. It'll be even bigger and hopefully even more impactful with other thought leaders. We're working on bringing a great slate of people together that are thought-provoking, that have been senior level leaders, that have been senior level advisors. And our mission in life is to help you get through this, not just survive, but also thrive. So hopefully you'll let us do that and you'll join us again next time. With that, I thank you, and please do stay safe and healthy.